Good day and welcome to the Ministry of Tourism special interview program, Tourism One-on-One, where we explore topical issues affecting the tourism sector as we tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Kingsley Roberts, your host, and with me today is Director of Tourism Economics and Facilitation in the Ministry of Tourism, Ms. Jhanelle-Rae Bowie. Welcome, Ms. Bowie.
Thank you for having me.
Today we examine the economic impact of tourism globally, regionally, and locally by breaking down the numbers. Ms. Bowie, you're the economist. Tell us, how important is tourism to the global economy?
Okay, thank you for that question, Kingsley. So when we think about the global economy and we think about everything that is produced and consumed, which is what they call gross domestic product, which is GDP, the travel and tourism sector actually represents almost 11% of that GDP, which is significant. We're also seeing where the travel and tourism sector accounts for 330 million jobs worldwide, which is also about 11% of the global employment. So you would see there where there's definitely some impact. Well, that is pre-pandemic, of course, as 2019. But we're seeing where that GDP as well, in terms of the 10%, that is actually 9.2 trillion US dollars. I know a lot of us don't hear the word trillion very often, but it just shows us that the tourism sector contributes a significant amount to the global economy. And it also contributes 5% to all investment, all types of investment. So that infrastructure is about 4 or 5% of overall investment, which is significant.
So it's big business then?
Of course.
So take us back now to GDP. So break that down now, because we're breaking down everything.
Okay, no problem.
What does that really mean?
Okay.
Break it down for the average viewer.
All right, so think about everything in an economy or a country that is produced and consumed. So think about what we consume as consumers. Think about what the government spends in their expenditure. Think about what we invest. Think about what we save. All of that contributes to GDP. So it is the total production of an economy. So everything that an economy is able to produce, and that also accounts for our exports and imports as well.
Okay. And you spoke about employment now. So go back to that. What's tourism contribution to employment globally?
So that's about 10 or 11% globally. And that is just from a direct perspective. Because remember, we have direct contribution to employment and we have indirect. So direct are things that we know: hotels, airlines, attractions, ground transportation. But there's an indirect aspect of tourism, because remember that the tourism sector has to be supplied by manufacturing, for example, the beds that we put into the hotels. The tourism sector has to be supplied by agriculture, which is the food that is served in the hotels. So that indirect impact is actually even more as it relates to employment than the direct impact, because there's a trickle effect of tourism's contribution.
So you're talking about millions upon millions of jobs.
Definitely. So the tourism sector, as I said, from a direct perspective, accounts for 1 in 10 jobs. If you have 10 jobs, 1 person in that 10 is employed to the tourism sector directly.
So of all the sectors out there, right, tourism contributes 1 in every 10.
1 in every 10, for sure.
Globally.
For sure.
Okay. All right. So in terms of COVID-19 now, how has the fallout been in the global tourism sector due to the pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's been a nightmare. I mean, we know what happened in the first couple of months of 2020. It was a nightmare. For 2020 alone, it was about 65 million jobs that were lost from a global perspective. So remember, I said coming back from 300 million, over 60 million jobs were lost completely. And that kind of tapered into 2021 as well. So we're also seeing where that GDP that I spoke about 10% of GDP or 11% of GDP, that went down to about 5% of GDP for travel and tourism for the year of 2020. So we do know that a number of sectors were impacted. Planes were not flying at all. So can you imagine that employment? No air hostesses, no pilots, if you get what I'm saying. A lot of the accommodations, so the hotels were closed, or they were minimal occupancy. So you can imagine the ripple effect on those individuals and their families in terms of their income and the revenue generated.
So from what you were seeing, what was the main response globally in terms of how the tourism sector, because there's an international body, how did they respond?
Okay, so what we're seeing is that for the various international organizations, like the United Nations World Tourism Organization, which is the UNWTO, we're also seeing where the World Travel and Tourism Council, they kind of came together to form a coordinated response to developing protocols, because we would have to travel at some point in time. We just have to travel in a safe manner. So developing protocols, developing standards. There were different initiatives in terms of funding for various countries, because there are more countries. So for example, like the Caribbean, who were worse impacted by the pandemic than other countries. So we're seeing where a number of the international organizations came together to provide funding for countries who needed it a little bit more. We're seeing where countries provided funding as well for COVID testing, because when we do fly, we're going to have to get tested for COVID. So we're seeing where that regional response and global response was actually very well coordinated among the different countries. You also had, if you bring it back a little locally or regionally, CARIFORUM, who was actually coordinating CARICOM, their responses to the pandemic, because we do know that from a Caribbean perspective, the tourism sector actually represents more of GDP than it does globally, because it accounts for more of the tourism, more of the production for the regional than it does globally. So I would say.
So was there any region that was totally decimated? Because I remember in the early stages of the pandemic, the outlook was very grim, and the international bodies were saying some areas might just not recover. How was that panned out?
All right. So in the early stages, I know the Caribbean was significantly impacted, and I'll tell you why. So whereas in the US, when there was a little bit of bounce back, when the sector started to open, people were doing domestic travel. So if I lived in US and I live in New York, I might not fly to Jamaica, but I might fly to Florida, for example. But that is domestic tourism. So you're moving within the same country. But for the tourism for the Caribbean, we were still relying significantly on our major travel partners like the USA, the Canada, UK, and Europe. And we do know what happened with like UK and Europe with those long haul flights closer to the beginning of the pandemic. So we're seeing where the Caribbean was significantly impacted, I would say, as one of the major regions, just because we did not benefit as much from domestic tourism as states like countries like the United States or Europe or that kind of thing.
So it's a numbers game then, because they have larger populations.
Exactly.
Their domestic tourism could drive and sustain
for sure. And they're even thinking that a major component of the recovery of the tourism sector is going to depend on domestic travel, because people have realized how much they could have traveled within their countries without actually having to leave the borders. And also too, because of the strict protocols and, calls for vaccine, easier movement within the country is actually facilitating more of that tourism recovery.
Okay. So how is the recovery going globally, based on how things are panning out now?
All right. So we're seeing where for 2020, the tourism sector, which is when COVID just hit, there was a decline in about 75% of international travel. We're seeing that is recovering now to about 50% of international travel. So you have a lot more movement in the space globally, and I guess we will come to locally. So we're seeing where things are picking up, and we're anticipating, the experts do say that by 2023, 2024, we're hoping to get back to pre-pandemic levels. So people are still very hesitant, and there are still a lot of restrictions to travel in terms of testing, vaccine, and the various protocols. But we're seeing where it's about 50% of 2019 numbers as it is globally.
So is the demand still there? Because there was a feeling that if people are locked up in their houses for 2 years plus, will they really want to travel? So I guess it could break either way, where there's pent up demand, or they might say, sure, I get so used to just binge watching stuff. Let me just stay home.
All right. So we actually are seeing from an international perspective where there's a significant amount of pent up demand. And it is not just for international travel. As I said, it could be for domestic travel as well. But what we're seeing is that even though there is that demand, people are still wary of their personal economic situation. So we do know that because of the fallout in the tourism sector and because of the COVID-19 pandemic, persons were affected in terms of being laid off from work, regardless of the sector that you were in. So the business environment is also what is driving people's excitement to travel. If you don't have money or you're not able to travel. But we are seeing where the visitor is excited about coming back to the destination. We're seeing where even for Jamaica, we have people who are pre-booking, a lot of people who are booking because they want to come in the next 3 months or the next 6 months. So there definitely is that pent-up demand in the space globally.
Okay, so in terms of the employment numbers now, how are things coming back on stream with people getting back to work?
All right, so when the pandemic just hit in March 2020, about 90% of all tourism workers were sent home. 90%, that's almost 100, right? Because the borders were closed, Most hotels were not open. 90% of our workers were sent home. We're seeing that was even worse for like the ground transportation providers. So think about the Juta driver, the JCL driver, the Maxi driver. 97% of those drivers were home.
So it's pretty much the same picture globally. That was the situation.
So globally, it wasn't as bad as 90% in terms of employment, because remember, globally, the tourism sector is just one sector of many, if you get what I'm saying. But we are seeing where the employment fell off by about 25% globally, or almost 30% globally. But in Jamaica, we definitely felt the effects of that. The challenge is that, remember, that unemployment has a very specific definition. So while 90% of them were sent home, they were not unemployed, because they were still engaged by their work, by their employers in some type of way. Right. They were on reduced hours, reduced wages, but they didn't cut ties.
So it's more underemployment.
So it's more, well, I wouldn't say it's underemployment. So they were more laid off, if you want to say. So they were sent home, which is, but remember, they were still receiving some amount of payment. So we're seeing now in the sector, we do have actually about 70% or 60% of our workers that are back to work. It is a little bit more for the workers in the accommodation subsector, because we as Jamaicans, we have been having a good time at hotels, right, since the pandemic. So we are actually assisting with that employment in the accommodations. It's a little bit less for things like the craft vendors and the ground transportation providers, because while we may go to a hotel, we might not take a Juta to go to the hotel. We might drive. Okay. So the Juta and the JCL and the Maxi, they are still heavily dependent on the tourists coming to Jamaica. So we're seeing where the employment numbers are definitely coming back up. Still some ways to go, but we're definitely making some improvement.
So has the recovery been even?
All right. So when we look at globally and regionally, we're seeing that most economies are recovering at a steady pace. However, you do have, like when the sectors just opened back, you actually do have some countries that came out of the starting blocks faster. So you had countries that put in protocols very quickly, countries that put together insurance policies quickly for COVID, countries that did a little bit better in terms of their vaccine take-up, that kind of thing. So you do have countries that have fared a little bit better just because their recovery was a little bit better planned, I would say. But I think overall, all of the economies are recovering at a steady pace.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Bowie.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Join us next week when we conclude our discussion on the economic impact of tourism, globally, regionally, and locally, by breaking down the numbers. Take care and stay safe.